In this video I will present a bunch of rule of thumbs and suggestions on how to achieve sharp landscape images. It is, however, important for me to say that photography is not math. There are way too many unpredictable conditions in play to make a proper calculation on how to get sharp images. You have to think of photography as problem solving. What do you want with your photo? What stands in your way of achieving that? And how do you eliminate those problems? First thing to make sure is that your photo is actually in focus, and whatever in your photo that you want in focus is in focus. Sharpness and focus are two different technical terms, however not inseparable. To achieve maximum focus, I usually use single shot AF, which is of course autofocus. Then I use flexible spot medium, and then I simply just enlarge my photo, find wherever I want to focus, I focus on that, and then I take my shot. In that way, I make sure that whatever I have focused on is perfectly in focus. Focusing is on its own a huge topic, and if you haven't seen my video from last week, be sure to check that one out. Here I dive much deeper into getting a super focused photo from very front to the back. So the next thing to understand is your aperture, and aperture is measured in f-stops. Aperture can be a little bit tricky to understand because when you increase the number on the back of your screen, the f-stop number, then you make your aperture smaller, and that sounds a little bit counterintuitive. However, there is some logic behind the madness because your f-stop number is actually a fraction. So when you have f4, it is actually 1/4, and when you have f8, it's 1/8. So obviously 1/8 is less than 1/4. So that is why your aperture actually gets smaller when you increase the number. It's because you make that fraction smaller. If you increase your f-stop too much and make your aperture too small, you start to introduce an optical phenomenon called diffraction. And diffraction tend to make your images more ghostly or more soft. So as a rule of thumb, try to avoid using the uppermost 3 aperture values, which for most people, if they're using almost any lens on a full frame camera, it's f18, f20 and f22. But as I said, it's a rule of thumb. Sometimes it is beneficial to use f22. Most full frame lenses tend to be most sharp from f8 to f11, and if you open up further, then you start to get less sharp images again, so all the way down to f4 and f28. But again, it is very important that you make these tests yourself. Simply just take your camera, put it into aperture priority, make sure that there's nothing too much in the scene that blows around, and just take a photo at f22, f20, f18, 16, 14, all the way down. Stay at the same focal length, compare those shots, and then maybe do it again in a focal length a little bit further in and a focal length all the way to the end. Another thing to be aware of is your sensor size. APS-C sized sensors and 1-inch sensors and anything smaller than a full frame lens tend to have the sharpest point of their native lenses at a little bit lower f-stop value. So let's say 5.6 for this one compared to an f8 on this one. The lens you use plays a significant role in regard to getting a sharp photo. It all comes down to lens design, the quality of the glass, and how much glass there's in the lens. So that is also why prime lenses, as a rule of thumb, tend to be sharper simply because there's less glass in them. If you compare a professional prime lens with a professional zoom lens, you can for the most part see a sharpness difference if you pixel peep. But in most circumstances, nobody cares, nobody can see the difference. However, if you compare a professional zoom lens with an entry-level zoom lens, you can usually see quite a significant difference. It is a little bit hard to compare them, especially between sensor sizes, but you can see them here side by side. And I would definitely say that the professional 24 to 105mm f4 lens is sharper than the 18 to 50mm kit lens from the A6000. DxO has a huge lens database where they compare different lenses on different camera bodies. So if you want to see whether or not the lens that you want to buy is sharp on different camera bodies, be sure to check that one out first. It might give you a hint about the quality of the lens before you buy it. I of course also has to mention megapixels. The more megapixels a camera has, the more details it can potentially show. But it is hugely important that you use a sharp lens if you have a high megapixel camera. So this one here is a 42 megapixel camera, and it just requires sharper lenses. Megapixels and the sharpness of the lens goes hand in hand. If you want to learn about composition in landscape photography, be sure to get my 2 ebooks on that subject. There are links to both the full versions and the free light versions down in the description. And now on to some more practical photography tips. And on the most basic level, it's simply just about keeping the camera as steady as possible when you do landscape photography. And if you so decide to handhold your camera, you can definitely do that. You don't need to use a tripod all the time. Then there's a few tricks that you can use to make sure that you optimize for sharper images. And that is to have like a good firm grip on the camera. Don't stand with your camera out here and try to use the display here. Make sure to grab the camera with one hand on the lens and another one on the grip, and keep, if you absolutely want to use the monitor, keep the camera as close to your center of gravity as possible. Personally, I definitely prefer to keep the camera up to the eye, look through the viewfinder, because then I can rest the camera on my face, against my face, and that also helps to keep the camera as steady as possible. When I was in the military, I learned to use the breath to my advantage when I was shooting, literally shooting. And you can do the same thing when you photograph. Simply just take your camera up, use your breath to your advantage, so when you breathe out, then you take the shot. Instead of you just like and shoot away. Breathe out, take the shot when there's no micro vibrations, and then you're good. You can of course also make sure that you put on image stabilization. When you're hand holding, it's a no-brainer. And the longer the focal length you use, the more important these small tips become. Image stabilization, use your breath to your advantage, rest the camera against your eye, and then take the shot. Also, a fast shutter speed is a really good idea, but it is somehow compensated by the image stabilization. Another super important tip is, of course, to get and use a tripod. And the rule of thumb is that the bigger and heavier the tripod is, the more sturdy it is, and the better it is to keep your camera steady. However, I have been using travel carbon fiber tripods like this one for 99% of my portfolio. They work perfectly. You don't have to have one of those big, super expensive tripods. This one here works perfectly for sharpness. However, don't get one of those $20 tripods. They suck. Where a tripod is very beneficial in regard to sharpness is when you have a low shutter speed. So that could be, as we see here, in a forest. There is surprisingly little light in a forest. It can be on an overcast day, which it is from time to time here. And it can of course be during night or in other low light situations like the blue hour. Another rule of thumb when you're shooting on a tripod is to turn off image stabilization, especially if you're using longer shutter speeds such as 1/10 of a second, half a second, and so forth, because the mechanism that try to counter for micro vibrations when you handhold the camera will actually move the lens and camera a little bit, which can shake the entire setup and give you blurry photos. However, I have experienced that in windy conditions, when there's a lot of wind and not even a sturdy tripod is enough to keep the camera from shaking, you can actually turn image stabilization back on again. But it is something you will have to figure out yourself on location. And speaking of wind, when you are in windy situations, it is a really good idea to contract your tripod and get your camera as close to the center of gravity of your entire setup as possible. You even want to contract the tripod legs and get the camera all the way down close to the ground. That is something I do quite a lot when I shoot on windy days in the Faroe Islands or in Iceland. Another highly beneficial function that I use all the time is to use the camera's 2 seconds self-timer. Depending on your setup and how uneven the ground is and how far up the camera is, you might want to increase that self-timer to 5 seconds or even 10 seconds. But for the most part, you can just use 2 seconds. This ensures that when I hit the shutter, I can remove my hand and make sure that the camera is all steady when it takes the shot. What I've also found to be highly beneficial is to use silent shooting on my mirrorless camera. That is the same as using mirror lockup on a DSLR camera. This ensures that there are no mechanical things within the camera that moves when you take the shot. So on a DSLR, it locks up the mirror, waits a couple of seconds and then takes the photo. And with silent shooting, it simply just makes sure that there's no mechanical shutter within the camera moving when you take the shot. Alternatively, if you do not want to touch your camera when you take the photo, you can either use a wire trigger or you can use a remote. I use neither. Sometimes I occasionally do take a photo via the app on my phone that is connected to the camera. Some photographers like to hang their camera backpack in this little hook underneath the tripod, and that is to make the entire setup more heavy. Personally, I would advise against it. One, if a gust of wind catches the entire setup, there is a bigger chance of actually tipping over your camera and the tripod. And simply because the entire backpack hangs here, it might actually start swaying in the wind, and that might create more micro vibrations than actually prevent micro vibrations. As I just said, as a rule of thumb, you do not want to touch your camera when you take the photo. However, in very windy conditions, as I experienced out at Lyngvi Lighthouse, you can definitely put a gentle push on top of your lens just to push the entire setup here a bit further down and make it more heavy in that way. It does remove a lot of the micro vibrations that the image stabilization cannot take. And on very windy days like that one, I do not shoot with a 2-second delayed timer. I shoot in continuous shooting and I just hammer off a lot of photos at once, and usually one of them is sharp. What can also have a huge impact on the sharpness of your photos is the ground where you place your tripod. If you're on a beach, make sure to press the tripod down a little bit further into the sand so it doesn't sink in when you're taking the shot. If you are on a wooden pier or something close to a harbor, or you're standing on some woods, make sure that you're not walking around on it while you're taking the photo, because that will of course also make the camera sway a little bit. So make sure that you are on solid ground. It is also absolutely crucial that you keep checking your photos when you're on location. You may think that your photos are sharp and then you come home and everything is blurry. Be sure to check your photos on location when you have got the photo you think you want. Check if it is sharp. It is such a bummer if it's blurry and you come home and you can't redo the photo. If you want to learn about composition in landscape photography, be sure to get my 2 ebooks on that subject. I have just released Landscape Composition 2, and a huge thank you to all of you who have already got it. The new one is 149 pages long, which is a little bit longer than the first ebook. Both of them contains 10 chapters on very important topics to understand composition in landscape photography. They are designed to be easy to read, and there are tons of examples in them. You can even get a free light version of both ebooks, one by signing up to my newsletter, and one is simply just for free down in the description. The full versions are of course also available down in the description of this video. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you learned a lot. As always, I would highly appreciate both a like and a comment.